Okay, guys, here's the stuff in book 2 that, I thought was important, and it's stuff that you have to kind of look up to understand. And so we just thought we'd kind of help and put this together, see if it's useful. So first of all, bear in mind the golden thread is two things. It's like literally Lucy's hair, because remember that connected her to her father. Lucy and her mom, sort of stretching disbelief, have the exact same hair. Remember that from book 1? And also it's Lucy herself, like as a metaphor. She's the golden thread that binds the family together. And this is going to keep coming up, so just pay attention to it when you see it. Remember in book 1, hunger was capitalized in the neighborhood Saint Antoine, where everyone was really poor. And that symbolized that, hunger was its own thing. And it's sort of like people were so hungry that hunger was its own force in the revolution. And so death is treated the same way here. You notice that it's capitalized, which is random, like you normally do that, and it's to show, oh, the legal system is so cruel, we expect people to die as a result of the legal system. So Dickens is just pointing out that it was particularly bad in his time period. When you see the messenger, just remember that's Jerry Cruncher from book 1. He's the same guy who rode up to Jarvis Lorry, in the mail coach and delivered the message, "Wait for Mademoiselle at Dover." And Jarvis Lorry sent back the response, "Recalled to life." Well, that's Jerry Cruncher. It's the same dude the whole time, so don't let that confuse you. When Jerry Cruncher speaks, he says like stupid things. Like he says aggravator, and that's because he's mispronouncing aggravator. He's calling his wife an aggravator, like she's driving him crazy. And bear in mind, like that's the wrong word. To aggravate means to make bigger or worse. So you can aggravate like a rash, but you can't aggravate a person. I mean, if you irritate me, that's not going to make me bigger. That's insane. So he means irritator. So all this kind of stuff shows that he's uneducated. So when he says Anna Dominoes, he means Anna Domini, which, the year of our Lord, Anno Domini, year of our Lord. So all that's showing that Jerry Cruncher is uneducated. So you're getting the perspective of, somebody like Jarvis Lorry, somebody like Charles Darnay. They're both well-educated. And then you're also getting this poor, uneducated person's perspective. So that's one of the reasons that the book has kind of stayed a classic. You know what I mean? Okay, so the mud on his boots let us know that he leaves after bedtime. So he comes home and everybody goes to bed, and then when everybody wakes up the next morning, there's mud on Jerry's boots. Well, that you're supposed to go, oh, I get it. He's sneaking out at night. And you're going to find out why. Just stick with me here. When he yells at his wife for flopping means praying, like a bending forward in prayer. And it shows that, she thinks that whatever he's doing when he sneaks out at night and gets his boots muddy is evil, whatever that is. He makes the point, hey, I'm making extra money to feed our son, lady. So A, it's morally ambiguous. He's obviously doing something wrong, but he's feeding his family. He's providing for his family. So there's kind of good and bad going on, right? So Defarge in book 1 was morally ambiguous, and then here we see Jerry Cruncher being morally ambiguous, and you'll see that a couple of times through the book. And then it's also social commentary. Remember, Dickens grew up poor, and so he really understood how difficult it was to make ends meet in this time period. Notice, and these are the beliefs of the time period. So Jerry Cruncher's son, young Jerry, like his eyes are really close set. So back then they believed in phrenology, and this little picture kind of shows you they believed, they could run their fingers over the bumps in your skull and like figure out your personality. It's pretty funny. But so people in Dickens' time would have said, oh, close set eyes, that means he's stupid. I mean, it's almost completely random, but they believed it at the time, so just go with it, right? And then you'll notice that because of his father's influence, young Jerry is turning into a bully. He's turning into this sort of uneducated person. And so Dickens is making the point, cycle of poverty. If the parents are poor and uneducated, then they don't know how to raise their children up out of poverty and all this kind of stuff, right? And then remember that Jerry has rusty fingers. That's going to come back around. That's going to explain what Jerry's doing in the middle of the night when he sneaks out and gets his boots muddy. So just remember that. It's going to come back. In chapter 2, the Old Bailey, if you Googled it, it's the central criminal court of England. So when people are like, oh, go to the Old Bailey, that means like go to court. And it also is synonymous with going to jail. Notice when Jerry's talking about, he says, that's barbarous. You can't tell whether he's saying the treason is barbarous, like only a barbarian would commit treason, or hanging, drawing, and quartering as a punishment for treason is barbarous. And, Dickens doesn't do anything accidentally. He's pointing out here, look, yes, treason is horrible, but the punishment for treason is just inhuman. Hanging, drawing, and quartering is almost exactly like what it sounds like. The person would be hanged, almost, there's a difference between hang and hung, right? So the person would be hanged almost to the point of death. And then, and I'll make this brief because it's kind of freaky, they would tie, each ankle and wrist to a different horse and send the horses running. And that would pull the person apart. I mean, and it was public spectacle. People would that was their, instead of going out to the movies or whatever, they would watch these public executions. So the kind of cycle of violence is making people more violent. They're desensitized to it, that it's normal to them. It would never seem normal to our society to see something like that. And then when Jerry makes that point, the clerk, and they would have pronounced it Clark in England, I don't know why, but the clerk says, well, it's the law. What are you going to do? It's the law. Is he saying that the law is barbarous, or is he saying, hey, it's the law, so that makes it okay? Dickens is not clear here, and he's not clear on purpose. I'm sort of committing the intentional fallacy here, but my interpretation is that Dickens wants us to go, oh my gosh, I also have questions about this, right? Bear in mind, it's a little bit of an irony here. You notice that Charles Darnay is messing with the herbs that are strewn out in the court. He's sort of messing with them with his fingers, almost like a little nervous habit. So the lawmakers just threw prisoners in jail, didn't worry about cleanliness or, proper food or hygiene or any of that kind of stuff, right? Well, then the lawyers and the judges would get those diseases when the criminals came to court. So they were all dying from the same diseases. And so the lawmakers could have saved themselves. They strewed these herbs out because they thought that would help protect them from the diseases. So it's this really sort of self-fulfilling cycle of yuckiness. The narrator also points out that violent punishment doesn't deter violent crime. And, they found that they've done studies on, now in the modern period on the death penalty, and they found, it doesn't actually work all that much as a deterrent. But what Dickens says is happening in his time period, or, has his narrator say, is that it increases bribes. And you'll see that in two places. Not only does it increase bribes within the jail system, like give me better food, give me better treatment, I'll bribe you. But also when people were executed, their families could bribe the executioner to sharpen the blade, or, so that the execution would be faster and less painful. That also happened across the channel in France during the French Revolution. So Dickens is drawing a lot of parallels there. This is a really, really important line. You'll notice it, I think it's about halfway through the chapter. The narrator says, whatever is right. An aphorism that would be as final as it is lazy, did it not include the troublesome consequence that nothing that ever was wrong. And if you kind of think about that, you realize if you say, oh, well, whatever happens, that must be for a reason, that must be what was meant to happen, that means you're never stopping to think, oh gosh, this thing that happened was wrong. We shouldn't have allowed that. We should have fought against that evil system. And Dickens, you remember, we were talking about this in book 1, that he's all about the social commentary. And so Dickens strongly believes, oh, we ought to fight against this negative system. So that's why he sort of makes this point. Remember when Defarge was letting the Jacques, right? And of course that was not their name. It's a code name because they're revolutionaries. He was letting the Jacques go in and look at Alexander Manette because he's becoming a hero of the sort of nascent French Revolution. And they were paying Defarge to go upstairs and peer at Manette through the holes to say, oh yeah, he's really real. We can sort of build a revolution behind this guy as a symbol. Right? In the same way, people in England paid money to watch trials at the Old Bailey. That's one of the reasons that execution was like the expected outcome, because they're giving people what they want, right? Just like at Bedlam, and you may have heard of Bedlam, it was sort of a famous insane asylum at the time, horrible conditions, and they would treat the inmates really, really horribly to provoke them into kind of a manic episode so that people would see something interesting when they went to watch people who'd been committed to the insane asylum. Truly horrible, truly barbaric that people would act this way. And so Dickens is constantly sort of throwing this at us. Yes, we're civilized, quote unquote, right? But we're not always acting in a civilized fashion. Notice that the U.S. justice system is really getting in swing when Dickens is writing. And so Dickens is kind of looking at the growing United States justice system across the ocean and saying, let me show you what not to do. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. So Charles Darnay, first of all, okay, interesting initials. Charles Dickens, Charles Darnay. I'm just throwing it out there. Okay. Also, the name Charles means a good man. My father and my son both have that name for that reason, because it means a good man. And so you're supposed to sort of understand, again, Dickens doesn't do anything accidentally. You're supposed to understand Charles Darnay is a good guy. Yes, he's on trial. Yes, he's accused of treason, but he's a good man. And people knew more about the meanings of flowers and the meanings of names and the meanings of all of these kinds of things back in Dickens's day. So people would have known what that meant. It had been a name within royalty and the aristocracy for, generation after generation. Notice also that the English court calls King Louis of France, Louis, right? They're purposefully mispronouncing it. And they still do this in England today. They'll say fillet instead of fillet, or claret instead of claret, because they're sort of saying, hey, we're not going to do things the Frenchy way. We're going to do things our way. So they are sort of being disrespectful to King Louis by pronouncing his name phonetically, with English phonics rather than with French phonics. And so Lucy and Dr. Minette are the witnesses they're talking about at the end of chapter 2. Go to chapter 3. You find out the only evidence against Charles Darnay is that he goes back and forth between Dover and Calais, and his servant named Roger Cly. He's a very important person. Don't forget him, right? So Darnay's servant, Roger Cly, is like searching through his stuff. This is terrible evidence. Okay. The next thing, John Barsad, the Patriot, right? So this is, you should be doubting everything that happens here, because when somebody's like, I'm a patriot. Why are you saying it so often, dude? Like, why are you throwing it in my face? I'm not sure I believe you, right? And this is exactly what's happening here. John Barsad, his name is probably a reference to a character in Much Ado About Nothing, John the not so nice word. We can talk about this in class when the year starts if you want, but the basic idea, you don't want to hear the whole, spiel about the Shakespeare play, but the basic idea is that with John Barsad's name sounding so much like that Shakespearean character, and he's clearly saying he's a good guy when he's pretty obviously not, that's a pretty clear allusion if you've read Dickens and Shakespeare, and of course Dickens' entire audience would have read Shakespeare, so Dickens' audience would immediately have known, I don't trust this guy. Turns out John Barsad, the Patriot, is also a professional gambler. So, what? Okay. Now, my last line here got cut off. I'm sorry. But you've got to remember that everybody, and I've got a little picture here for you from Christmas Story, remember that movie? Everybody was so bundled up in book 1 in the mail coach that you'd never recognize anybody. Well, so that's when Jarvis Lorry and Lucy Minette are put on the stand, and they're like, do you recognize this dude, right, Charles Darnay? And they're like, no. Everyone was wearing hats and scarves and mittens and the whole business. You'd never be able to recognize anybody. It was pitch black. There's no electric lighting in this time period. There's no way. And so that's how Stryver wins the case, is that there's no way you'd be able to recognize this guy, right? So also, we've got this look-alike. Sidney Carton and Charles Darnay miraculously look exactly alike. And you're going to find out a little bit more about that later. But, you should suspend disbelief here. Okay, so first of all, it should seriously worry you that Stryver, the lawyer, is able to convince the audience that Barsad looks like Judas. Really? Who knows what Judas looked like? There were no cameras back then. So that the audience totally buys into it should let you know, okay, these are not good legal proceedings. For all its flaws, the American justice system is definitely better than what they had going on in England in this time period. The flies are literal and figurative. There are literally flies because of the diseases I was telling you about a couple of slides ago, but they're also figurative. It's a metaphor, meaning everybody's whisper, 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 gossip, gossip, gossip. Okay. Note that each lawyer is able to totally convince the jury, right? So the first lawyer gets up and he's like, I'm stating my case. And the jury's like, yes, we agree 100%. And then Stryver gets up and he states his case and the jury's like, never mind, I agree with you. And they keep switching back and forth. Dickens is sort of pointing out, like, look, really uneducated people don't know how to vote properly. They don't know how to, be a member of a jury. They don't know how to run a democracy. And again, Dickens is always kind of looking across the Atlantic to what we're doing in America at this time period. And he's really advocating for an educated populace, right? So they know what they're doing. Jerry points out another recalled to life when Charles Darnay is acquitted, tra-la. Okay. So Darnay and Carton, you'll see the pictures on the right in the like TV miniseries or whatever. Susan Sarandon, the actress, her little brother, played both parts. Very, very exciting. Anyway, it's not a good miniseries. Don't go check it out. You will not enjoy it. It would be less painful to read the book. So anyway, this is Carton looking at Darnay. This is Sidney Carton looking at Darnay. His face had become frozen, as it were, in a very curious look at Darnay, an intent look deepening into a frown of dislike and distrust. So they haven't talked at all, and Carton's already like, ooh, I kind of don't like you. Not even unmixed with fear. With this strange expression on him, his thoughts had wandered away. So the whole idea is that Carton is looking at Darnay and saying, hey, we look a lot alike. We're a lot alike on the outside. What makes us different is what's on the inside. Carton has not had the advantages Darnay has had. Carton doesn't have the sort of pleasing personality that Darnay has, and life is a heck of a lot harder for Sidney Carton. So it's all about like, oh gosh, would things have been different if I had been born this guy instead of me? Chapter 5, again, remember I told you in book 1, always try to notice the titles. So Striver, he's a striver, meaning like he's really, really ambitious. He's a lion. Carton is the jackal. Okay, that's what the title is talking about. The idea is that jackals help with the kill, but lions get the glory, like in the real world. Okay, see pictures that, right? The jackal is seen as a scavenger or a parasite, but it's actually doing the dirty work that makes the lion look powerful. And that's the metaphor for the relationship between Carton and Striver. Okay, Carton, yes, is a high-functioning alcoholic. He is drunk a good deal of the time. Every time he's putting that cold, wet cloth on his forehead, he's trying to sober up so he can think clearly and do this law work. But Striver's an idiot. There's no way Striver would be a successful lawyer without Carton doing all the behind-the-scenes work and making all the actual big decisions. So that's where that comes from. It was Carton's idea to save Darnay using their resemblance, but Carton won't admit it. Striver's like, hey, this was your idea, well done. Carton's like, no, he doesn't want to admit that he's actually a pretty awesome guy. His self-esteem is like really low. It's very sad. Bear in mind, and you guys will recognize this, being GSMST people, Carton has many signs of high IQ, intense focus. He's your typical gifted underachiever, like smart kid who doesn't turn stuff in and then has a low GPA and doesn't get into a good college. Just cautionary tale I'm going to throw in there. Also notice, again, the names always mean something, right? Sydney, the name Sydney, comes from Saint Denis. Well, the French pronunciation is Saint-Denis. Sydney Saint-Denis, right? So Saint-Denis or Saint Denis was a martyr, for Christian persecution. So Christians were being persecuted, and Saint-Denis steps in and, saves them and whatever. He is said to have picked up his own decapitated head after he was executed, and wandered off with it. I'm a little bit dubious about that story, but I felt it was interesting and decided to share. Notice that Carton is like, oh, Lucy's not pretty. She's like just a doll, man. Whatevs. I totally don't like her. But we all know that Carton is crazy about her. Okay, this is typical guy. It will say he doesn't find a girl attractive when there's no way he thinks he'd ever get her to go out with him. That's what Carton is saying, so don't believe him there. Notice that the narrator seems really sympathetic to Carton. A lot of times, particularly the sort of American dream is like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and we tend to be sort of irritable with people like Carton. Like, dude, you're clearly the brains behind Striver. You could go out on your own. Quit being such a moping sad pants, right? But the narrator in this book seems to be pretty sympathetic to him. And the reason is there's a lot less social mobility in Charles Dickens' society and time period than in ours. So Carton really does have fewer chances in Dickens' time period than he would in ours. Chapter 6, you want to remember that Miss Pross is extremely, like, crazy devoted to Lucy. Lucy is like her whole life. You want to remember that. It's going to come back in book 3. She keeps saying, oh, hundreds of people come to visit. Hundreds of people. It is not true. You'll notice later that she's like hundreds of people. When she's talking about Charles Darnay, Miss Pross realizes that Charles Darnay is crazy in love with Lucy, whose only apparent value is that she's beautiful. Whatever. We won't go off on a feminist tirade here. But So Miss Pross is really threatened by Charles Darnay because does Lucy need a chaperone? Does she need this woman to take care of her once she's married? No. So Miss Pross's position is threatened. Plus, she loves Lucy and she doesn't want to give up her role in Lucy's everyday life. And obviously, a husband would, take away some of that attention. So just remember that. It's going to come back in book 3. So Miss Pross, remember, she mentions her brother Solomon Pross, and he makes this one mistake, and that derails his life, but he's super awesome. Remember him. He's going to come back in book 3 as well. Bear in mind, Lucy is probably about mid-20s at this point in the book. Most young women her age, particularly with her looks, would have been married. She could have made a good marriage, even though they didn't have money. She was beautiful, so somebody would have married her and she'd have been financially stable. There's nothing she can do as a career, really. I mean, she could become like a laundry woman or something, which is the lowest of the low. She doesn't have a whole lot of options. It's not like she can actually I want to go to Georgia Tech and be a mechanical engineer. That is not an option for Lucy Manette in this society. So notice that she's giving up all of that stuff. She's not going to dances. She's not meeting young men. She's not moving in society because she's caring for her father. And she never, ever points this out. She never mentions, hey, I'm giving up my whole life to take care of this old dude. What is Lucy going to do after he dies? She has no visible means of support. She has this small trust fund from her mother, which is going to be difficult for her and Miss Pross to live on, for the rest of their lives. So Lucy is really putting herself in a precarious situation to look after her dad. So it's pretty cool. You're supposed to go, oh my gosh, she's such a great lady. Wow, she's so awesome. Okay, remember that Alexander Manette, Lucy's dad, thinks he knows who denounced him and sent him to the Bastille. That's the prison. It's going to come back around later in the book. Just remember that Manette thinks he knows who sent him there, okay? When Darnay goes to the Tower of London, okay, so it's a totally different prison. It's Tower of London. It's not the Bastille, but it's sort of the a parallel to the Bastille. It's the big, terrifying prison in this major city. Well, they find DIG scrawled into scratched into the stone. Manette's barely visited the tower. He was not imprisoned there. So when he gets freaked out that Darnay's like, hey, they found this thing. Is that interesting? That's gotta foreshadow something about the Bastille. Does that make sense? So remember this. Manette could not have done the thing in the Tower of London. He was never a prisoner there. So when it freaks him out, you've got to realize, oh, it must be a parallel from when he was in prison in the Bastille. And you're going to find out about that later. It's been a night to bring the dead out of their graves. Just remember, Jarvis Lorry and Jerry Cruncher both have 2 jobs. They work at Tellson's and they dig people out of graves. Now, for Jarvis Lorry, it's figurative. He's resurrecting Alexander Manette. But for Jerry, this is his actual second job, and you'll find out more about that in a minute. Stick with me here. Okay, so chapter 7, Monseigneur is the French word for my lord. Mon is the masculine pronoun for my, and then seigneur is lord. So this guy, Monseigneur, that's not his name. That's his title, my lord. Everybody has to call him my lord, which means he's the number 1 aristocrat in France. And he's more a symbol than a real person. It's one of the reasons he's not given a real name, is he symbolizes the whole horrible aristocracy. Because Monseigneur has a servant with 2 gold watches, that shows the incredible wealth that he has. His servants have multiple gold watches. Okay, compare and contrast this with the neighborhood of Saint-Antoine, where people are literally starving to death, and you'll see this is pretty disgusting. This is a joke. He would have died if he'd only had 2 servants. What? That's obviously a joke. So I just want to make sure you sort of recognize that. And then when Monseigneur is kind of thinking to himself, the earth and the fullness thereof are mine, saith Monseigneur. Sorry, that was my son getting excited about Tale of Two Cities. Chase, say hi.
Hi.
Anyway, so this is a paraphrase of the Bible, and Monseigneur is being extremely blasphemous here. This is a big deal to the Christian society that Dickens was writing for. Bear in mind, okay, Monseigneur is evil, right? And you kind of get the idea with the gross wealth while people very near him are starving to death. But here's another sort of evil thing that he's done. So his sister was a nun. Yeah, she's in a convent. She's a nun. And he finds this guy who's crazy rich, and he's like, oh, hey, marry my sister. You can have status and influence at court, and you pay me to marry my sister. What? Okay, so this is pretty horrible. Monseigneur sold his sister for money, essentially. Sold her into marriage, but still, this is pretty nasty. Chase, go, baby. Later on, okay, so Monseigneur is married. We're not going to find out anything about this woman except that she also sort of represents the traditional female aristocrat. She just has a child and gives it immediately to what they would have called a wet nurse, a poor woman who would have nursed the child. And so that the whole idea there is like they don't want to ruin their figures. Look at the picture of the dress in the bottom right-hand corner. They wore these really low-cut dresses, so they don't want to be distracted by children. They don't want to have their their figures messed up or anything, but they still have to produce heirs for their husbands. So that's why that would happen. It's supposed to show them as just inhuman in the same way that Monseigneur gives his servants all these incredible gifts of wealth, which lets him show off his own wealth, right? So they're both really inhuman. The convulsionists, that was an actual fashionable religious movement. They would sort of go into these trances, and they would, shake and all this kind of stuff to show how devoted they were to their religion. This is a sort of sect of Christianity. You want to compare that to Miss Pross, who literally has what they would have called catalepsy. She has a seizure disorder. So again, these people, the convulsionists, are kind of faking it to look super religious, but Miss Pross really suffers from this. So it shows again, gosh, these are really horrible people. The whole scene when everybody's waiting to meet with Monseigneur, that scene characterizes the aristocracy, and it shows the origins of the revolution. Like, these people are nasty. There's a reason that the peasants in France revolted. Was the French Revolution really bloody and nasty? Yes, okay? But you can see why it happened. That's what Dickens was trying to do there. Just note also the executioner's outfit. If you look in the top right corner, that's the kind of wig that he would have worn. So the executioner is wearing clothing that, would have fed the entire neighborhood of Saint Antoine for a few months. So it's sort of a gross show of wealth. So here's this incredibly wealthy guy executing, peasants, people who maybe would steal a loaf of bread to feed their families, for heaven's sake. So, it's a situation. Okay, so the handsome evil man is Monsieur the Marquis. And it's really, really easy to mix up Monseigneur and Monsieur the Marquis. So I'm just going to kind of help you, keep those two dudes separate as we go through the next 2 or 3 slides. So first of all, Monsieur the Marquis has gone to meet with Monseigneur, doesn't get what he wants, right? Hops in his carriage, and he's just like flying down the road. He doesn't care who he hurts. He just thinks the peasants ought to get out of his way because he's super important. Well, his carriage runs over a child. A few paragraphs later, you find out it was Gaspard's child. Remember, Gaspard was the guy who wrote the word blood on the wall in Saint Antoine when the red wine spilled outside of Defarge's wine shop. So this should seem super ominous to you, okay? Now, notice that Gaspard, everybody in Saint Antoine is literally starving. Remember, hunger was capitalized. They are literally starving. So when Monsieur the Marquis realizes that he has killed Gaspard's child, he flicks him a gold coin. When Gaspard flings it back, it's a really, really important symbol. These people are starving. For them to throw back a gold coin, I mean, that would have kept them alive for a very, very long time. That would have fed his whole neighborhood. But he's standing up for the first time to the aristocracy and saying, wait a second, I won't take your blood money, right? This is a really, really important moment. And Madame Defarge is standing there knitting. Okay, that should also be super ominous. And then Monsieur the Marquis gets offended when Gaspard throws the coin back into the carriage. He's like, I would ride over any of you willingly and exterminate you from the earth. Remember that phrasing, the word exterminate is going to keep coming back. Now remember, when do you use the term exterminate? You have like bugs or vermin. If you have a rat problem in your house, you get an exterminator. So the aristocracy is talking about the peasants like they're vermin. Okay, and so this shows you where the revolution comes from. All right, let's move along. So here's an interesting and exciting quotation. This is about the guys who are waiting to see Monseigneur. The exquisite gentlemen of the finest breeding, so the aristocracy, wore a little pendant, that means hanging, trinkets that chinked as they languidly moved. These golden fetters, and if you look at the bottom left, that's a picture of a fetter, like a fetter or a manacle that goes around the wrists or around the ankles, and it holds prisoners. So the narrator is saying that all this gold is actually imprisoning these people. Wearing all this gold and showing off is what starts the French Revolution and gets these aristocrats killed. So this is actually really important. Rang like precious little bells, and what with that ringing and with the rustle of silk and brocade and fine linen, there was a flutter in the air that fanned Saint Antoine and his devouring hunger far away. So all these huge shows of wealth, right? The silk and the brocade, those are expensive fabrics, obviously. And wearing all this gold, those huge, demonstrations of wealth, that's what starts the French Revolution. That's what makes the peasants so angry that they're willing to just go crazy and start killing all the aristocracy. So I put Jaws down there because, it's foreshadowing, obviously, right? Chapter 8. So Monsieur the Marquis heads into the sunset. Remember, this is not Monseigneur. Monseigneur does not leave that doesn't leave his house in the course of this book. Notice that at the beginning of chapter 8, he heads into the sunset, right? Well, if you read like Lord of the Rings or whatever, the sun sets in the west. That's always symbolized death, moving toward the afterlife. There's a lot of foreshadowing about Monsieur the Marquis here. And then at the end of the chapter, he leaves escorted by the Furies. So it's like his fate is coming to get him, right? The extreme poverty and taxation in the area where Monsieur the Marquis lives are there to characterize the Marquis. It's his responsibility. So the whole idea of the aristocracy back then was something they called noblesse oblige. So like if you're noble and wealthy, you're obligated to help take care of the peasants on your land. Well, the French aristocracy had quit doing that. And so again, these people are literally starving. Okay. And this is there to show this is the Marquis's responsibility. He is the aristocrat in charge of this area. It's his land. He's supposed to have sort of a paternalistic relationship with the peasants who live on his land and take care of them in the same way a father would. It gets confusing here because he's called Monseigneur, but it's just because it means my lord. This is all about Monsieur the Marquis, not about Monseigneur, the big important guy everybody was waiting to see in the previous chapter. Don't let that confuse you. Everything from here on out is about Monsieur the Marquis. You can forget about the other guy called Monseigneur, okay? Now, there's a mender of roads. He's going to be called Jacques. That should tell you he's a revolutionary. He sees someone hanging under Monsieur the Marquis's carriage, okay? And just remember, okay, so Monsieur the Marquis runs over Gaspard's child. Gaspard flings the gold coin back, and now someone's hanging under his carriage following him. Let's start putting two and two together here, right? Now, what would happen in the way this aristocracy worked is, if you were a peasant on this land, you'd go to your sort of local aristocrat and say, help me out. This is the thing I need. And if it's a reasonable request, they're supposed to help you. That's kind of what they're there for, right? This is an old feudal system, Feudal, not Fefile. Anyway, what you're supposed to interpret about this woman who begged for a tombstone for her husband demonstrates the extent of the problem. You're supposed to interpret, okay, this guy probably starved so that he could feed his wife and children. And now he's dead, leaving them without a visible means of support. So you're supposed to think about the position that this man is in. If he eats the food instead of his children, then his children starve. But if he doesn't eat the food, he starves, and then there's no one there to provide for them. So it's a real catch-22. This is why the French Revolution started. Okay. Now, Dickens is also asking us to ask the question, what does noble really mean? So literally noble means aristocratic, of noble birth, right? Part of the aristocracy. But our notion of nobility, it came about in this time period when people are saying, wait a minute, you can be born noble, but still be a total jerk like Monsieur the Marquis, right? And so who is more noble? The peasant who starved to try to feed his family? Lord, this book is sad. Sorry, y'all. Or somebody who was just born into a title. Well, I mean, Dickens has given us a pretty obvious answer. Now, the Monsieur the Marquis gets to his house and he tells his servant he's waiting for Monsieur Charles. Oh, Lord. Uh-oh. That should be a certain amount of foreshadowing for you, right? Okay, so this is a good time to bring up, these two quick things. I'll make it quick. The three estates, and of course now there's the fourth estate, but you learned about this in history, I'm sure. The three estates, you have the clergy, because the church, of course, came first. And then the nobility. The clergy and the nobility together made up 3% of the population, but they controlled the vast majority of the wealth. I mean, we talk about wealth inequality in modern day America, but we have nothing on these people. So this horrible imbalance is why the French Revolution started. And then also the Hegelian dialectic, because we're going to talk about this in a second. This is going to keep coming up. This is something that every educated person in Dickens' time period would have been familiar with. So Dickens would have understood this. The basic idea is that you come up to the first blue circle, you come up with a thesis, you have an idea, right? And then you consider it in terms of its opposite, and you synthesize those and come up with a new idea, right? So what's supposed to happen is you say, hey, the aristocracy isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing. Let's get rid of the aristocracy. That's your antithesis. But then you put them together and you go, you know what? Actually, maybe we can reform the aristocracy so it works better. It works the way it's supposed to work. Well, that did not happen in the French Revolution, as you know from history. They just went with the antithesis, right? They just were like, okay, let's exterminate the aristocracy. The aristocracy has been trying to exterminate us. Let's kind of flip that on its head. So the Hegelian dialectic makes sense. That's how things are supposed to work. But the French Revolution did not go in that direction. So bear with me on this one because it's going to come back around. Okay, so chapter 9, the whole, the stone head or the Gorgon's head, same thing. I'm supposed to be paralyzing horror. The whole story about holding up Medusa's head and whoever looked at it turned to stone. And so the guy who defeated her looked at her reflection in a, metal surface. That's why the stone face keeps coming up. But these are a couple of actual stone pictures. The pictures are actual stone heads that were on castles around this time period. So just to give you an idea. Bear in mind Louis XIV. So the king we have now in the book is Louis XVI, but Louis XIV said that, his was the line that was never to break. Well, we know King Louis the 16th is where the line is going to break. That's why Dickens points that out, because it's horribly ironic. Then we find out in chapter 9, Charles Darnay is actually Monsieur the Marquis's nephew. Okay, so again, Darnay, named Charles, it means a good man. Darnay is truly noble in both senses. He's a good guy, and he's literally born into the aristocracy, but he's obviously renounced it, and you're going to find out why. This is pretty cool. Do note that Charles Darnay and his uncle, Monsieur the Marquis, do not shake hands. That means we are not friends. I do not trust you. It would have been a hugely symbolic thing to Dickens' time period. So you find out that Charles Darnay's dad and the Marquis were twins. This is going to parallel with Darnay and Carton. I just want you to remember this, okay, that Charles Darnay's father and uncle were identical twins, and Darnay and Carton are almost identical twins, and just remember this. So notice that Monsieur the Marquis always talks about himself. I want this, I want that. But Darnay says our land, our people, to demonstrate that he's sharing the responsibility. If people are starving on his land, he takes personal responsibility for that, which is the opposite of the Marquis. So again, bear in mind the Hegelian dialectic here, two things. One is that Darnay is doing it right? Darnay is actually presenting a synthesis, by which I mean a reformed aristocrat. If we let people like Darnay be in charge, the feudal system would have continued to function pretty nicely for another few hundred years, probably. But that doesn't happen. Again, they just go to the antithesis, the French Revolution, and stay there, and then a lot of people die. So Hegel has this sort of refinement on the dialectic called the master-slave dialectic. Here's the short version. So there's a master and a slave, right? The master doesn't know how to do anything for himself. The slave is the one who makes the clothing, makes the food, finds fresh water, all that kind of stuff, right? Well, what happens is eventually the master is so reliant on the slave that the slave becomes the master. The slave has all the power in that relationship. That's what's happening in this time period in France. 97% of the population, the peasants, are doing all the work. The aristocrats don't know how to farm. The aristocrats don't know where to find fresh water. The aristocrats don't know how to make their own clothing. And so as soon as the 97% says, you know what, we're not going to be the slaves anymore, we want to be the masters, everything's going to change. And that's what you're going to see here. Dickens is playing on that because, again, he knows that his entire educated audience would have known this. So Darnay brings up his mom's dying wish that he help take care of the people on their land. And Darnay's mom was apparently the super awesome lady like Lucy Manette, super sweet and beautiful and all that business, right? And then like a Disney princess or something. And the Marquis is like, no, I'm not taking responsibility for this. I'm going to spend what I want and do what I want. So yay, thanks. All right. The Marquis says, my friend, and he says that to Charles Darnay, which is weird. I mean, does your uncle call you my friend? It's bizarre, right? My friend, I will die perpetuating the system under which I have lived. That's a certain amount of foreshadowing. I mean, again, so the peasants are just going to the antithesis. They're just saying, yeah, we want total revolution. Well, the aristocracy is also at the antithesis. They're just resisting. They're unwilling to come to a synthesis or sort of a reformed aristocracy. So everybody is contributing to the horror of the French Revolution here. Notice that the Marquis asks about Alexander and Lucy Manette, which should freak you out. How does the Marquis know about them? More on that later. So Darnay is actually sort of an anglicized version of the French name D'Aulnay, right? Now, that's a real place in France. Guess what region it's in? Saint-Denis. Sidney Carton? Oh, it's all starting to tie together, right? Only in a novel would this happen, by the way. The irony is that D'Aulnay was the name of the lords, okay, that's lords, plural and possessive, who ruled that region. So again, you have this Hegelian notion of synthesis, right, that these are reformed, pretty decent lords, and if the aristocracy had had more of them, we might have been all right. There was a real Charles D'Aulnay, and you can look him up. The Wikipedia page about him is pretty accurate, actually. Now, when the Monsieur the Marquis says to the servant at the end, burn him in his bed, he's literally talking about Charles Darnay, but he's not really serious. Okay, this would have reminded Dickens' audience of King Henry II. So he was a medieval king, and you may have heard the story. The short version is Thomas Becket was the Archbishop of Canterbury, so incredibly powerful religious leader in England. And so Thomas Becket refused to give the king what he wanted. Just trust me, you don't care about the whole thing. So Henry II goes to his advisor. He's like, dang it, will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? So they're like, oh, the king wants Thomas Becket killed. Let's go kill the Archbishop of Canterbury. So they do. Two horrible things happen. Well, three. I mean, they kill a guy. That's bad. But also, Henry is like, dude, I never actually wanted you to kill him. It was an offhanded comment. Well, I mean, they didn't have CCTV and security cameras or anything, so we have no idea of knowing what Henry II really said, right? Secondarily, so Thomas Becket, everybody thought he was a show-off and he wore fancy priest outfits and whatever, but it turns out he was wearing something under his priest robe called a hair shirt, and it was really itchy. It's like wearing a wool sweater with nothing under it, and it would have been, I mean, it was a medieval period in England. It would have been infested with fleas. It would have just been a nightmare. So the whole idea is that Thomas Becket was actually apparently a really good priest and really, standing for the right thing and secretly doing these important Christian rituals that people in his time period would have believed in. So it makes the king look horrible. This is the whole kind of same thing that's happening with Monsieur the Marquis, that he kind of equates to Henry II. Does he really want Charles Darnay dead? I mean, probably not literally, but this is going to come back around. So remember that little story. And also, Dickens' audience would have known that whole story. If you want to know more about it, again, the Wikipedia page is accurate. I don't want to tell you always go to Wikipedia. It's about 90 to 92% accurate, depending on when they sort of, test it. But in these two cases, it's pretty good. Okay, so out in the sort of local graveyard in the area, it's the parcel of land that Monsieur the Marquis owns. The figure on the cross might have come down for anything that could be seen of it. The basic import of this line is there could be a miracle. Jesus could come down from the cross and nobody would have noticed. So Monsieur the Marquis is just so evil that he's, messed everything up, right? So So there's water in the fountain. The sun is rising, and the reflection of the rising sun is red on the water, makes it look like blood. The picture on the right should show you kind of what that would look like, except a fountain, not like a marsh or whatever that is. But also it's clearly foreshadowing blood in the water. Come on. And then, so when the Monsieur the Marquis turns up dead, drive him fast to his tomb, this from Jacques. It means bury him quickly, so it's really dehumanizing. The Jacques, you know, all the Jacques of the revolutionaries, there are a bunch of them, but this particular one is going to turn out to be Gaspard. Gaspard is going to turn out to have been the guy who was hanging under Monsieur the Marquis's carriage. So Monsieur the Marquis kills Gaspard's son. Gaspard immediately clings to the bottom of the carriage, follows him all the way home, and kills him in the middle of the night. But he signs it Jacques so that everyone will know, hey, this is a precursor of the revolution. So this is a huge, huge, huge deal. Chapter 10, a year has passed since Darnay renounced his inheritance when he met with his uncle, and he feels like he knows Lucy well enough. He says, you know, hey, Dr. Manette, I kind of want to marry your daughter and stuff. And bear in mind, in this time period, a man asked the woman's father for her hand in marriage. This is a really old custom, which came from the notion that, I mean, women were really always property in these European societies, that the father, or if the father had passed away, an older brother would decide who she married, would give her away at the wedding, all that kind of stuff. And we still maintain some of those traditions. If you've been to in a wedding recently, you might have seen the father, sometimes the mother and the father, walking the bride down the aisle and then sort of handing her off to the husband. It comes from these really old traditions when women really were nothing but property. But, you know, now people just kind of like the tradition, and it doesn't, you know, you can decide for yourself whether you think that, you know, sends a weird signal. Up to you entirely. Anyway, so Darnay is like, hey, dude, I want to marry your daughter. And Manette resists only because he's sad about losing his daughter. He knows what Lucy has given up for him and how devoted she's been to him. And, you know, he doesn't want to lose her. He thinks, oh, if she gets married, she's going to go live somewhere else, and she's not going to live with me anymore, and I'm going to be super sad, because he missed her whole life. Like, he missed her for 17 years. And so that's the only reason he's resisting. He recognizes that Charles lives up to his good name, and it lives up to his name and is a good man, right? When Charles Darnay says that he hasn't written or spoken to Lucy, that means he has not secretly said anything lovey-dovey to her without letting her dad know. So he's a really honorable man. I mean, imagine, you know, if you're a guy, like, having to call a dad, or if you're a girl, you know, the guy calls your dad, hey, is it all right with you if I ask your daughter to prom? I mean, nobody would do that anymore, but that's the kind of society that they live in, when women were really sheltered. So this is kind of sweet. I mean, it's a little patriarchal, but it's kind of sweet, right? So you interpret that how you want to. Darnay is like, hey, dude, I want to tell you what my real name is. And Manette's like, no, don't tell me, don't tell me. Oh my goodness. Okay, so this is some serious foreshadowing here, right? So remember when Manette looked at Darnay all weird? And remember when Manette said he thinks he knows who denounced him? All this is going to add up. So don't worry, Charles Darnay was not the one who denounced Alexander Manette. So don't jump to that conclusion. But anyway, Darnay is like, oh, well, okay, you know, I'll tell you my real name on our wedding morning. Well, it's too late. It's too late then. They're like on the way to the wedding. So this whole scene is like, oh my gosh, if somebody had just said something, all kinds of badness could have been averted. It's just like in the Harry Potter books. If Harry Potter would just go and say, hey, Dumbledore, the following bad thing is occurring, Dumbledore would have been like, poof, fixed. The book would have been 5 pages long. But whatever, nobody asked me. All right, chapter 11. So Stryver is like, I'm going to propose to Lucy. Now, look, Stryver wasn't a real dude. There are no actual paintings of the guy. But I have chosen a representative painting. I feel like this is kind of what Stryver might have looked like. So there. You're supposed to just dislike Stryver and think he's a big old jerk, right? So Stryver is like, oh, well, you know, Lucy's poor, so if I ask her to marry me, I'm doing her this massive favor. I'm so awesome. And then Carton equivocates, and Stryver asks whether he approves. Carton's like, why shouldn't I approve? We know Carton disapproves, not only because he's well aware that Lucy is too good for Stryver, because Stryver's a jerk, but also because Carton likes her, and it's all very sad, right? Note that Stryver and Carton see different reasons to disapprove. Stryver thinks Carton would disapprove because Lucy's poor. Striver thinks Carton would disapprove because Lucy is like beneath him socially, but Carton disapproves because Striver's a jerk, right? This last little bullet point here is the 3 reasons essentially. And then at the end, when Striver's like, hey, think about it. Carton is like, I'll think on it. And he doesn't mean, oh, I'll think about what you've said, Striver. Thank you for that advice. What he means is, I'll think on it. Like, I will remember this insult that you have given me, you jerk. Right? All right, so chapter 12, another fun and exciting ironic title, The Fellow of Delicacy. Obviously, Striver has no delicacy. He has no tact. You have something at the beginning of this chapter called Free Indirect Discourse. You don't really need to learn that or anything. But the whole idea is that like the narrator is speaking from the perspective of the character. The narrator clearly does not think that Striver has a noble mind. The narrator is revealing to us that Striver thinks that Striver has a noble mind. Striver thinks it would be awesome for him to give Lucy his hand in marriage. Come on. Excuse me. Like, the narrator is pointing out how ironic it is that a jerk like Striver would be like, oh, I'm going to do this poor pretty girl a favor and give her myself. Oh, come on. And then at the end, Mr. Striver is like, you shall not put me in the wrong, young lady. I'll do that for you. What he means is he's not going to let Lucy turn him down, but I'll do that for you means like, you don't get to make a fool out of me. I make a fool out of myself. Oh, shoot. And like Striver doesn't even realize he said this stupid thing. Striver flips Laurie's words at the end to make it seem like Laurie was saying that Lucy wasn't good enough for Striver. We know that's not true. Striver either is so dumb he can't figure it out, or he's just trying to make himself feel better. And I'm not sure which it is, honestly. All right. Chapter 13. So the fellow of no delicacy, that's supposed to be about Sidney Carton. Like he has no tact and no, he's just not respectable or whatever. But obviously he has a lot of tact and he has a lot of good stuff deep down in there. But it is weird that like Edward Cullen, he like hangs out outside of Lucy's house and like watches it in the middle of the night. I mean, is he protecting her from what? I don't know. It's weird, man. Lucy tells Carton that she believes in his future worth, like, oh, you're going to do something awesome someday. That's big time foreshadowing. And then she says, can I not recall you? First of all, remember that whole recalled to life thing. So Lucy is like, oh, can't I help you become a better person? Can I bring you into the light of society or whatever, right? So that's important, just thematically. And then Carton says this to Lucy. Will you let me believe when I recall this day that the last confidence of my life was reposed in your pure and innocent breast? And breast just means like the chest area. It doesn't mean anything weird in this case. But Carton is saying to Lucy, hey, I'm making my last confession to you. So remember that Dickens's society was heavily Christian. They would have understood this as standing in for last rites. Like Carton is trying to absolve himself of all of his sins by confessing to Lucy so that he'll, go to heaven or whatever. And he's not thinking about this in any literal sense, but it's going to come back around in book 3. So remember it. And then Carton says this to Lucy, think now and then that there is a man who would give his life to keep a life you love beside you. I mean, if that's not pretty obvious foreshadowing, you are not paying attention. Chapter 14, the honest tradesman. Okay, obviously Jerry Cruncher is not an honest tradesman. We know that he goes out in the middle of the night. He gets his boots all muddy, and he also digs people out of graves. So you probably already suspect, and he's got rusty fingers, so you probably already suspect what's going on, but now we finally find out for real. So Jerry has 2 jobs, as we've discussed before, and we find out what they actually are right here. So Jerry gets tips for helping ladies across the street outside Tellson's. So some, rich old lady needs help crossing the street. They didn't have street lights or, or stoplights or anything back then. So, he helps them across and they tip him. Well, he doesn't make enough money to live. It's not, reliable. Do you know what I mean? It's not like he gets a salary or anything. So, and he also runs messages, but he just doesn't make enough money. So the reason when he sees the funeral go past that he gets excited is because he's what was called a resurrection man or a grave digger. And that's how he makes extra money to feed his family. Okay. So is it bad that he digs up dead bodies and sells them to, medical science for research? People don't want their bodies dug up and sold, But conversely, he's feeding his family and he's furthering medical research. So again, he's sort of morally ambiguous. Is he good or bad? I don't know. Look at the pictures on the right. If you look at the middle one, so people didn't want their bodies dug up and sold as cadavers, right? And so people would actually have their bodies buried in these metal cages. This is a real picture, and people really did this. And they also, if you look at the bottom right, they also would build these big fenced in enclosures and stuff so that gravediggers couldn't get in and dig up their bodies. So the funeral, it turns out, is for Cly, who was the servant who set Darnay up. But, okay, so first of all, remember Cly, because he's going to keep coming back. We thought he was dead. He's not in his coffin. That means he's alive somewhere, right? But they've just put stones in the coffin to trick people so he could escape. And then Jerry goes with his grave digging friends to dig up the grave that night, and he's not in there. So not only does Jerry get frustrated, he doesn't make his extra money, but also now we're like, well, where's Cly? That's weird because we don't trust him already, right? And then when somebody fakes his death, we super duper don't trust him. So Jerry Cruncher's son, young Jerry, realizes that Jerry isn't fishing because the fishing rod is rusty and he never brings so many fish. Okay, so that's why he follows him. When he talks about the complete angler, and like fishing tackle, the gentle craft, he's just using fishing metaphors to talk about grave digging. So don't let that confuse you. It's all about grave digging. There is no literal fishing. Now, it was a real book. When he mentions Isaac Walton, like that was a real book. Here are some pictures. Jerry beats his wife because Cly wasn't in the coffin, and Jerry believes that his wife's prayers have worked against him. So it's kind of interesting that Jerry doesn't pray, but he clearly believes that prayer works because he's mad at his wife that she must have prayed against him. Now, why would she pray against him if he's bringing home extra money to feed their child? Well, because her religious beliefs are so strong, and she really believes that grave digging is sinful. The domestic abuse in the Cruncher family shows not only the sort of stereotype of the poor, but also this sort of dogmatic attachment to religion. And so Dickens is trying to kind of give a complete picture of the life of a poor family in this time period. They're unusual only in that they only have one child. Many of these families would have had quite a few children they were trying to feed. So chapter 15, again, Madame Defarge is knitting. It's always scary when this happens. It's always foreshadowing, and you're going to find out exactly what's going on in a little bit. This should ally her with the Greek fates. In your mind, she's got these other women who knit with her. And that should make you think of the Greek fates where, if they cut the thread, that means your life is cut off. Okay. And again, more on this soon. The wine is thin because Defarge is watering it down for profit. Okay. So on the one hand, Defarge isn't making the extra money for showing off, Manette, and so he needs to supplement his income a little bit to keep his business going. Keeping his business going is good for his community. It's good for the neighborhood of Saint Antoine to have this business going. Conversely, Saint Antoine is extremely poor. These people can barely spare any money, and so now they're spending money on watered down wine. One of the reasons that people drank alcohol at this time period, yes, was escapism, but also because the water was unsafe and unhealthy. I mean, you could die from drinking the water, and fermented drinks were safer. So Defarge is, not entirely good and not entirely bad. At the beginning of chapter 15, when it says, everyone's drinking early with no money coming, that means they're there for a meeting. It was like, let's go to the wine shop at 2:00 in the afternoon. They're not actually drinking. They're there for a meeting, but they're pretending that they're there drinking to cover up for, their revolutionary activities, right? So the Mender of Rhodes shows up. He's also a Jacques, so he's also a revolutionary. I mean, we don't know what his real first name is, okay? He tells Defarge and all the other Jacques about Gaspard killing Monsieur the Marquis because Monsieur the Marquis ran over his child. He says, Gaspard was caught. He was hanged. And again, there's a difference between hanged and hung. So he was hanged over the fountain to poison the village water. So poisoning the water, is a metaphor for creating unrest and dissatisfaction. But also, literally his dead body is making the drinking water in this area unsafe. So this is pretty nasty. And bear in mind, the Marquis is dead at this point. So he's not enforcing this aristocratic rule. Somebody is enforcing that even after he's dead. So bear in mind, this is one of the reasons that the revolution happened, is that it's not just the aristocracy maintaining aristocratic control. The aristocrat dies and they're still torturing Gaspard and then executing him and hanging his body over the fountain, where it will ruin the water supply for everyone in this village. So this is pretty terrible. This is when Monsieur Defarge agrees to kill everyone in that family. Saint-Evremonde, Evre, or like every, right? And then monde is French for world. So everyone in the world. This guy is, a metaphor for all the aristocrats, right? Bear in mind, Defarge at this point doesn't know that Charles Darnay is really a Saint-Evremonde because he's the uncle, he's the nephew of the Marquis. Nobody but Charles Darnay knows this at this point. So the whole idea is, this is dramatic irony. We, the audience, are starting to put the pieces together and go, oh my gosh, Defarge, yeah, he wants to kill all the Saint-Evremondes because he assumes they're all as evil as Monsieur the Marquis, but Charles Darnay is one, and he's actually a really good guy. Oh no! Here we find out that what Madame Defarge and her friends are knitting is a record of the condemned. So they have this code, and they knit in a certain shape or a certain type of stitch, and that's a code, and they can, translate the shapes into letters, and those are the names of people they're going to denounce when the revolution comes, okay? So here's an interesting quotation. Jacques, said Defarge, judiciously show a cat milk if you wish her to thirst for it. Judiciously show a dog his natural prey if you wish him to bring it down one day. And that quotation is really important because Defarge is getting a little grief from the other Jacques, right, the other revolutionaries, about, oh my gosh, why are you letting the Mender of Roads go on this big fun tour of the aristocracy? Like, why are you you appear to be supporting the aristocracy, and we're going to start this revolution. We're totally against them. And then Defarge says, you know what? Let's let this guy see how the aristocrats really live. That'll throw it in his face. Then he'll really be a revolutionary. He'll see all the gold and all the jewelry and all the wealth and privilege and power. And he'll recognize, hey, I know people in my village who are starving to death. And so he'll really join the revolution. That's why that's really important. And then, Madame Defarge is talking about what she knits. And she's like, so, for instance, shrouds. And, that's what they wrapped dead bodies in before they were buried. So she's coming out and pretty much admitting that she's knitting the names of people who are going to die. So that's pretty creepy. Chapter 16, Barsad shows up again, and he's a mercenary spy. That means he's a spy for hire. So someone has hired him to spy on the revolutionaries. That means somebody knows that the Defarge wine shop is kind of the center of the revolution. And you notice that Madame Defarge knits in his name while Barsad is in there. So, yeah, he's not going to last long. It does not take a long time to strike a man with lightning, said Defarge. How long, demanded Madame composedly, does it take to make and store the lightning? So I want you to bear in mind, Madame Defarge and her husband, Monsieur Defarge, are playing very, very different games in terms of the revolution. Defarge thinks, I'm going to start this revolution, strike like lightning, it's going to be done, right? Whereas Madame Defarge is like, wait a second, I've been making and storing this lightning or vengeance or punishment for a very long time. And you're going to find out in book 3 a story from her early life that's going to demonstrate she has had it out for the Saint-Evremonde family for years. She's playing a very, very long game. So there's a big difference between the spouses there. And it's also a reminder, lightning would have been associated with Jove, okay, or Zeus. And so the whole idea is that, like, this is written again for a Christian audience. And so Madame Defarge is sort of making the point, wait a minute, God could do something. God is not, coming down and solving all of our problems. So we're going to have to do it ourselves. And it goes back to that whole thing at the beginning of book 2, whatever is right. And then that means that you don't consider, well, not everything that happened could be right. Some stuff has to be wrong. So here Madame Defarge is coming back around to that. Barsad tries to trick Defarge, both of the Defarges, into admission meaning that they're revolutionaries, but he fails. He's like, "Good day, Jacques." And Monsieur Defarge is like, dude, my name is Ernest. What are you even talking about? So Barsad knows that the revolutionaries are calling themselves Jacques, and he's trying to trick Barsad into answering to it. But both of the Defarges are way smarter than John Barsad, so it's not going to work. Notice that the narrator says Barsad is there to pick up any crumbs he could find or make. So he's totally willing to lie, totally willing to make up evidence against these people, which would get them killed. So that's not awesome, right? And then Barsad is asking a lot of questions about knitting, and he's trying to trick her. He's like, "Oh, it was terrible. What happened to Gaspard?" He doesn't really think it's terrible. John Barsad doesn't care two bits what happened to Gaspard, but he's just trying to trick Madame Defarge into admitting that she's part of this sort of nascent revolution. And so that's why she has to lie there. Now, Defarge at this point finds out that Charles Darnay really is the nephew of the Marquis, and Madame knitted steadily. That means that Madame Defarge knitted in Charles Darnay's name. Okay, so names are important. Okay, Dickens is always going to choose these things on purpose. Bear in mind, Monsieur Defarge considers Charles Darnay a Saint-Evremond because, in the patriarchal lineage, that's how he was born. Defarge never stops and thinks, wait, Darnay rejected that. He rejected his inheritance. He rejected his name. He's trying to be that Hegelian synthesis. He's trying to be a good aristocrat, a reformed aristocrat. And so Defarge never gives him a chance. So again, there's guilt on both sides here, right? Now, bear in mind, the revolutionaries have all called themselves Jacques because it was a really common name. And so the aristocrats would just call any peasant Jacques Goodman, meaning like, I don't care what your name is. I just want you to do this work for me, right? So they kind of reclaim that nickname. So calling themselves Jacques is like, hey, the aristocrats used to use this to like dehumanize us, but we're going to reclaim it. We're going to take over this name as a name of power. And that's kind of cool, but then they don't give Charles Darnay the same opportunity. Now, at the very end of this chapter, it says that Madame Defarge and her, ladies, knitting, counting, dropping heads. Now, Dickens' audience would have recognized when you knit, you could drop stitches, like you miss a stitch and you have to go back and fix it. But they're counting dropping heads. So that's not a mistake. That's suggesting the guillotine and the French Revolution coming and all that. Chapter 17 and 18, Alexander Manette is thinking of a real child. So he's in this sort of weird like dream state situation. He's not thinking of Lucy, but he is thinking of a real child, and he doesn't want to tell Lucy about that real child. You're going to find out who that child was in book 3. Just remember it. Manette goes deathly pale when Darnay shares his real name, and then Manette starts making shoes again. So remember that Manette thinks he knows who denounced him, and then he freaks out when Darnay says he's a Saint-Evremond. Come on, you can put those two together, right? Bear in mind that Charles Darnay, he's a tutor. He can't afford a real wedding ring for Lucy. And so Laurie makes them a present of not only a small diamond ring, but also, silver and not like stainless steel like you get at Target, but I mean, real silverware. And so Laurie doesn't make a ridiculous amount of money. He's middle class. So for him to give such lavish presents, that's him being very generous. It shows that he doesn't spend a lot on himself. Remember book 1, and his suit was a good quality suit, but it was kind of worn. So that's pretty cool. Like, that's pretty cool of Laurie, Jarvis Laurie, that he's trying to give them something really nice, right? Bear in mind, Darnay could be crazy rich because he has now inherited from Monsieur the Marquis, but he refuses to be crazy rich because he won't profit off the labor of the peasants. So that's pretty awesome. Remember that Alexander Manette was also called the Doctor of Beauvais. He's also called the Shoemaker. Those are all the same dude, so don't let that confuse you. Bear in mind, this is another Inferno reference when Alexander Manette makes shoes for 9 nights, and then he wakes up the morning of the 10th day and he's better. It's another reference to the Inferno. And we'll read that in 10th grade, so you'll learn a little bit more about it during the school year. But the whole idea is that, like, there were 9 levels of hell, and Dante has to go through all those 9 levels to come through hell and start rising toward heaven. And that's what you see happening to Manette here. You go through hell, right? And that's what Manette has already done. And then you go through purgatory, and then you get to heaven. So you're going to see that happening in book 3. Chapter 19, Jarvis Laurie tells Manette about the last 9 days indirectly. He's like, oh, I have this friend who was making shoes. because he just doesn't want to freak Manette out again. And plus, they're kind of stereotypical men, like, we cannot discuss our feelings, we are men. So that's kind of what's going on there. Manette says that whatever freaked him out has to do with his original mental shock. That's how we know that Charles Darnay's last name is what sent Alexander Manette into that spiral of regression and having to make shoes and all that. So that's why we suspect that it was a Saint-Evremond who denounced Alexander Manette and had him sent to the Bastille. At the very end of the chapter, Laurie and Prost look like murderers destroying the bench. This might suggest vengeance. They're really angry on behalf of their friend, and they're taking it out on that bench. That's the only reason Dickens would really mention that. Chapter 20, Carton thinks so little of himself that after years he has to ask Charles if he can come by like a friend and drop the Mr. before Darnay. So at this stage, they were a lot more formal back then, so he said, Mr. Darnay, yes, Mr. Carton, for the first several months that they were acquainted. But when they became real friends and were hanging out, they would have started saying, Charles and Sidney. But so it's been years, and Sidney Carton finally is like, can I just call you Darnay? And so that's still keeping a lot of distance. So this is social coding that would have been pretty familiar to Dickens's audience. Both Lucy and Charles Darnay keep foreshadowing that Carton's going to do something good for them in the future. Just remember this in book 3, okay? And the last sentence points out that people really do care about Carton, but he can't see it, and he's still wandering outside their house at night like a guard dog, and he's all like sad and stuff, man. So I don't know. Again, the narrator clearly feels sorry for Sidney Carton here, but I'm just like, I don't know, like, strike out on your own, do something worthwhile. I'm kind of tired of your emotional sadness. So, you interpret that however you like. Chapter 21, the title, as the footsteps increase, this takes place in 1789, which is the year that the French Revolution got started. So those footsteps, again, mean two things: the footsteps of the revolutionaries in France and the footsteps approaching the Manette's door, right? So there are two things going on there. Paragraph 2 is like the first 20 minutes of the movie Up, okay? Lucy's afraid she can't have a child, or that she'll die in childbirth. Those things were fairly common. It was fairly common to die in childbirth at that time, relative to what it would be now. They didn't know, doctors didn't know to wash their hands between patients, so they spread disease and infection pretty rapidly. The little boy who dies is Lucy and Charles' son. He dies, but nobody's actually super, super sad because they believe he went to heaven, so they're just grateful to have had him for that time. This shows that the Darnay family, according to Dickens's audience at the time, were really good Christians and believed what the church was teaching at the time. So it's supposed to just reinforce what good people they are. That's the way you're kind of supposed to interpret it. And the Defarges and the Jacques, so the revolutionaries, lead the storming of the Bastille. And storming of the Bastille is what started the French Revolution. Madame Defarge's women, it says, are armed with hunger and vengeance. Okay, so they're also literally armed with like knives and stuff, but their hunger over so many years and their anger about the things that were done to them. So think about how hungry their children are. Think about Gaspard's son, being killed by Monsieur the Marquis, and Monsieur the Marquis just flings him a gold coin. Either reason would explain why they stormed the Bastille. Notice here that the peasants are incredibly violent. So you don't really want to be on their side because they're incredibly violent, and yet they've been through so much that you're sympathetic to them, right? This is a tough one. If you look at the pictures to the right, they tore down the Bastille. So the paintings on the previous slide, that's what the Bastille really looked like. It was huge, and they destroyed that massive building. So you can kind of see that the peasants were pretty mad. If you look at the size of those stones, that took a lot of work to destroy that building. So this is a big deal. I don't know if you guys have read David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell, but one of the things he talks about is that, you hear about the story of David and Goliath. So little bitty David goes up against this huge giant, and everyone's like, oh, wow, how could you possibly have won? Well, he wins. David should win because Malcolm Gladwell says he changes the rules of battle. He, instead of doing close combat, where he certainly would have lost, he, excuse me, he makes it, long range combat. He flings a stone, totally changes the rules. So of course he won. Well, that's exactly how the peasants win here. Sorry. I'm so excited about Tale of Two Cities. I'm all choked up. So anyway, what he's saying here is like, nobody would have thought that the peasants could overcome all the soldiers and tear down the Bastille, but they were so mad, and nobody had ever done anything like this before, and they had been so oppressed that actually, when you think about it, of course they won. The soldiers didn't stand a chance. The peasants have been so badly treated that Madame Defarge, who would have been a normal middle-class woman, like, your mom or me, is knifing people in hand-to-hand combat. That's what the conditions leading up to the French Revolution have done to people, okay? So think about like a normal middle-class woman whom you'd never imagine stabbing people with a knife. That's what these conditions do to people. So Madame Defarge wouldn't have been like this, except for horrible, horrible privation. And then when Defarge actually gets to the Bastille, he demands to see 105 North Tower. Remember that Alexander Manette, at the very beginning when he'd just been gotten out of prison, he was like, they said, what's your name? And he goes, 105 North Tower. Remember, he'd been so dehumanized, he didn't even have his name anymore? Well, so now Defarge is like, take me to see 105 North Tower. So this is another way we know that they're really trying to use Alexander Manette as like a symbol for the revolution. They're going to try to get people to follow this symbol of Manette, who's been taken out of the Bastille. So the 7 people are another example of symmetry. Not only do you have, so the peasants freed 7 prisoners who'd been kept secretly. So just like Manette, they freed kind of 7 other Alexander Manettes. And they also kill 7 guards, and they put their heads on pikes outside as sort of a warning to others, hey, things have changed. It's revolution now. Remember the beginning of the book, the narrator says the punishments are cruel and inhuman, which is why the revolution comes. But now the revolutionaries are using the same cruel and inhuman punishments. So you're supposed to ask yourself, is this justified revenge? Like the aristocrats did this to us, we should do this back to the aristocrats? Or does it say, nope, the revolution is cruel and inhuman, it also is doomed to failure? There are a couple of things in mind. First of all, the 7 prisoners and the 7 guards, and there's 7 what in Christianity? Deadly sins. Okay, so if you kind of have a look at the bottom right-hand corner, those are the 7 deadly sins if you're not familiar with them. I thought these little pictures were kind of cute. But, symbolism alert, right? Also, just bear in mind, England was terrified the revolution would spread across the channel. The English aristocracy was terrified of the French Revolution. Things were not as bad in England as they were in France. And so that's sort of one of the reasons that it never happened. But also, another reason that it never happened was that the French Revolution lost a lot of support in England after the September Massacre. So many people were killed in September of 1792 that people really felt like the French Revolution had gotten out of hand. And so England was like, oh, yeah, we feel like there's income inequality, but we're not ready to go that far. And so you had poets like William Wordsworth, who, he writes about trees and stuff. Anyway, he was like, yes, French Revolution, that is absolutely correct. You've been oppressed. Whoa, September Massacre, too much. I'm out. And he quit supporting them. And that was fairly common. Chapter 22. So Madame Defarge is no longer wearing the rose in her turban because she doesn't have to. The spies are too scared even to try to go into Saint-Antoine and catch revolutionaries because the revolutionaries are clearly in power now. So she doesn't have to wear the rose in her turban anymore because she doesn't need to warn the revolutionaries. They're in charge. Notice that her best friend is called The Vengeance. What is that woman's real name? We have no idea. We'll never know. So again, she's dehumanized by her desire for revenge. This aristocrat named Foulon, note that the French word for idiot is fou. It means like crazy or fool, okay? And he said, let them eat grass. This again refers to that apocryphal Marie Antoinette story of saying, let them eat cake. We don't know whether Dickens knew that Marie Antoinette never actually said, let them eat cake. We just don't know. But this is clear. There's clearly a connection. Let them eat grass, let them eat cake. Come on. Again, we have to sort of wonder if Foulon's punishment is in any way justified. Remember that this one woman in particular is recounting, a child has died of starvation, an elderly father has died of starvation, and Foulon doesn't care. So does he deserve what he gets? I don't know. You're going to have to make that decision yourself. Notice, this is a really important line, y'all. Not before dark night did the men and women, and that's the revolutionaries, come back to their children wailing and breadless. Okay, so they start this revolution because the aristocrats are keeping all the money that 97% of the population is making, right? And so all the peasant children are very hungry, if not starving. Okay, but to pursue the revolution, the adults leave the kids at home. They don't bring home any bread. They don't bring home, any food for the kids. And so just like the aristocrats, the peasants are letting their children starve. So Dickens is making the point, you're justified in revolting. This revolution is justified, but you still got to take care of your kids, y'all. So this is kind of a deep moment, right? And then Monsieur Defarge says at the end, to his wife, "At last it is come, my dear." So he's like, "Yay, the revolution is here." Well, returned Madame, "almost." Remember, she's playing the long game. Monsieur Defarge has gotten what he wanted, right? They're toppling the aristocracy. The peasants are going to be in control. We're going to be fine. But Madame Defarge has something else up her sleeve, and I don't want to ruin it for you. You'll find out what it is in book 3, okay? Chapter 23, notice that the revolutionaries made the land even worse. So again, just like the revolutionaries not feeding their children in Saint Antoine, the revolutionaries are burning their own farmland to spite the aristocrats. Well, y'all, you still have to eat, and you still have to farm, and you still have to feed your kids. So this is not the brightest idea we've ever had. And again, Dickens is sort of pointing out, when you have an uneducated populace, they don't know what to do. They don't know how to advocate for themselves in a way that is helpful and constructive. Monseigneur, okay, so we're coming back to this guy who was, in his house, right? This is not Monsieur the Marquis. He's long dead. Monseigneur, what he shows us as a symbol is that individuals might be good, but the aristocracy is bad overall. Okay, you can find certain good people like Charles Darnay, who is a son of Evremond, right? He's from just the worst aristocratic family there ever was. But the aristocracy is bad overall and needs to go. And that goes back to that Hegelian synthesis idea, yeah? The point of the burning chateau is that the revolution is almost counterproductive now. They're burning down Monsieur the Marquis's castle because why? I don't know, man. It's a symbol and they want to burn it down. Could they all have lived in there in a happy little hippie commune? Yes, they could have, but they don't. They don't see that. They just want revenge. They want vengeance, and they want to burn down the symbols. So the revolution starts going a little bit too far here, right? Right after they burn down the castle is when they go, "Oh my gosh, how are we going to pay rent on our little shacks and farmhouses?" Well, if you hadn't burned down the castle, you wouldn't have to worry about that, right? Notice that Gabelle, this guy Gabelle, he's just a local official, but the people want to kill him because he's been collecting taxes for Monsieur the Marquis. So notice that he gets up on the top of his house and he's like, "Oh, well, if they come in my house, if they're going to burn my house down, I'm going to jump off the roof and kill some of them. If they're going to kill me, I'll take some of them out with me." So Gabelle is not a great guy. He's also morally compromised. Yes, he's just doing his job, but he's taking taxes from Monsieur the Marquis from people who are literally starving because he's taken their last bit of money. So he, yes, he's just doing his job, but he's still not a very good guy. There are other fires and others killed of all classes. So bear in mind, some of the revolutionaries die, but also in many other villages and cities around France, they're burning down castles as part of the revolution. So it's not just happening to the Saint-Evremond family. This is widespread. Chapter 24. Again, the golden thread is binding the family. This is Lucy, and she's this very stereotypical, perfect woman. And so she's holding the family together, which is her role as a wife and mother. Come on. All right. So now it's 1792. So it's been another couple of years. The nobility is scattered. So the nobility that was able to get out of France they've run to other countries, okay? This reference to Sardanapalus, he was an Assyrian king, maybe. We're not super sure if he really lived, if this guy is a combination of a couple other people. The historical record is incomplete, but he lived in great luxury to the detriment of his country, which should sound like the French aristocrats to you. And so when he was finally defeated, he killed himself, but he took his concubines with him, and they burned to death on his funeral pyre. So pretty horrible guy. And he's there as a metaphor to show that the aristocracy is not responding well. They're not saying, "Oh gosh, you're right, we've really been oppressive, let us help fix things." They're like, "No, scorched earth policy, we're going to take you with us." So Tellson's Bank, because it's a French house and an English house, right? The French nobility go there. Jarvis Lorry has no idea why Darnay thinks he can help France. Darnay is like, "Oh, I kind of think I can help," because Darnay knows he's a Saint-Evremond. Darnay knows that Darnay is technically a Marquis right now. He's Marquis Saint-Evremond. But Jarvis Lorry is like, "Dude, you're an English tutor. What makes you think, like, you're not even a teacher? What makes you think that you can do anything about this?" So it's a little mystifying to Jarvis Lorry. The narrator says he thinks that any sane man would have seen the revolution coming. This is really interesting and important because hindsight is 2020, right? It's easy for me to sit here and say, "Oh, well, I mean, obviously the aristocrats were abusing the peasants so badly that the peasants were going to revolt." But it had gone on that way for so many hundreds of years that I don't think anybody really seriously thought, yeah, it's going to happen this time. You know what I mean? So what the narrator says is interesting there. It's supposed to make you think. Notice that Stryver immediately falls in with the French nobility who hate the peasants for starting the revolution. This is just more to show you that Stryver is a big old jerk, okay? Note that Stryver has no idea he's insulting Darnay to his face. In the bit where he's talking about the nobility, it never occurs to Stryver that Darnay is actually nobility, okay? And obviously Stryver is wrong. Darnay is truly noble, both literally and figuratively. I mean, yes, he's literally a noble, and Stryver doesn't know that when he makes fun of this missing nobleman to whom this letter was addressed, that, that guy is actually standing right in front of him. But also Darnay is a good guy, so he's noble in that sense, right? In the letter, it's addressed to Monsieur heretofore the Marquis, which means there's not an aristocracy anymore. Like, sir who would have been the Marquis, you, like, heretofore is sort of like hitherto. Like, I mean, you kind of used to be the Marquis, but there's no aristocracy anymore. Because Carton saved Darnay, and Darnay has a responsibility to his people. Darnay feels like he's responsible for saving Gabelle. So he can't just leave this guy to die. Even though, Gabelle isn't such a great guy. Remember that concept of noblesse oblige. Because you're a noble, you are obligated to take care of your people. And so Darnay does what his uncle never did, which is feel a responsibility to take care of his people and his land. Remember that Defarge used to be Manette's servant in the same way that, Gabelle is now kind of Darnay's servant. So remember that. And Darnay blames his own sort of weakness, right, for his irresponsibility. That means he's like, oh, I love my wife and my daughter, and, I love my father-in-law. Like, Charles Darnay really does care about Alexander Manette, also his father-in-law. And that's why he was, irresponsible in not going to France and really maintaining this land. He doesn't want to drag, Lucy and little Lucy, I think it's weird, like she named the kid after herself, whatever, over to France, and he doesn't want to drag Alexander Manette there. He doesn't want to upend their lives. So he doesn't want to do the wrong thing, and he, it's really hard for him to do the right thing here. So Darnay is in a really interesting position. Also, bear in mind, Darnay needed money. So Darnay has to go to England to become a teacher because he refuses to use the money that the Marquis used. So remember, Gabelle's collecting these taxes that are, taxing people into starvation. Well, he's collecting them for the Marquis. So Darnay can now say, all right, quit collecting those taxes, let the people have some money to eat. And so because Darnay's not getting that money, he now has to work. So, you're supposed to kind of admire Darnay here. He sends instructions to Gabelle to give the peasants whatever he can after the creditors were paid. What this lets you know is that Monsieur the Marquis was not actually rich. He's living off debt. He's living off credit. And so he's just using the peasants' labor to pay off his own debt so that he can continue to live in luxury. So this is pretty horrible. The whole thing about the lodestone rock, that means a magnet. And the whole thing about the Mariner is it comes from this poem, Rime of the Ancient Mariner, by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which was published at this time period. Coleridge was another one of those poets who was like, yay, French Revolution. Oh, no, September Massacre, I'm out, right, along with Wordsworth. What this means, this magnet, it represents Charles Darnay's guilt, okay? So the estate, the Saint-Havre-Cremond estate, is the lodestone rock, the magnet, dragging Darnay back to France because it's his guilt. It's his responsibility to these people, right? Now, they're going to talk about sin a little bit here. Darnay had oppressed no man, right? That's what Dickens' society would have called a sin of omission. He hasn't done anything wrong, but he also hasn't done anything right. Do you know what I mean? Like, if somebody wants to know something, you have that information, but you don't share it, it's a sin of omission. You didn't do anything wrong, but you also didn't do anything right. Now, the difference here is when Darnay lies to his family about why he's going to France, that's a sin of commission. He has committed that sin, right? And so Dickens' Christian audience would have responded to this. They would have said, oh, I get it. Because they would have sat through sermons on the difference between omission and commission, right? Also, bear in mind, if Darnay had told Alexander Manette the truth, Alexander Manette would have told him the whole story. So this is a horrible dramatic irony. And again, if Harry had just told Dumbledore what was going on, the book would have been 5 pages long. If Charles Darnay had just told Alexander Manette what was going on, none of the horror that's coming in book 3 would have happened, right? And so that's the end of book 2. And we'll do another one for book 3 just to kind of, help you out if you need it. Definitely shoot me an email with some questions if you have any. Thanks. Bye.